So good to be with you today as we gather together around today's passage from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 10, and reading verses 40 to 42. These are some words that Jesus speaks to his disciples at the end of a long section on instructions for the church's mission. Anyone who welcomes you welcomes me, and anyone who welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Whoever welcomes a prophet as a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. And whoever welcomes a righteous person as a righteous person will receive a righteous person's reward. And if anyone gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones who is my disciple, truly I tell you, that person will certainly not lose their reward. Thanks be to God for his holy word. Amen. Some of you may remember that last Sunday I mentioned the lectionary. Actually, it has a foretitle. It's called the Revised Common Lectionary. And you may remember that I said it's a rolling 3-year programme that should, in theory anyway, take the Church of God through the whole of the Bible in a 3-year period. It's a great thing to think that across the globe today, we are united with sisters and brothers in lots of churches as they gather around the same passage as we do, Matthew 10, verses 40 to 42. Just stop and think about it for a moment and just think what an amazing thought that is. The lectionary also has other virtues. For example, it means that we do span the whole of the Bible over 3 years. It stops preachers, if they're disciplined enough, from brushing difficult texts under the carpet, because if they have got the discipline, they will have to face up to those texts that sometimes in the 21st century we can find a little difficult. And also it stops preachers being on their hobby horses, going on a loop. I know I can go on a loop sometimes. You don't need to answer that. But certainly it does stop the hobby horse syndrome of preachers. Although, to be fair, I do remember the late Reverend Donald English once saying in a lecture this parody of a famous hymn when he said, 10,000 are their texts, but all their themes are one. However, if you can avoid that, then the lectionary does have some purpose. It has some faults too. For example, because it comes in bite-sized chunks, and certainly our reading today is a bite size, isn't it? It means that you don't always see the flow. You don't always get the pattern. You don't always get the symmetry of how one passage relates to another. Here's a case in point. In Matthew 10, verse 42, Jesus says, anyone who welcomes you welcomes me. But because we're on a bite-sized chunk, we can fail to see that this is actually very symmetrical with things that have happened earlier in the chapter. For example, in verse 14, Jesus talks in this way. He says, if anyone will not welcome you, then as you leave that town, shake the dust from your feet. And then in the passage that we had for last Sunday, he was talked about the fact that his disciples won't get treated any better than he was. So if he was maligned and rejected, then so will they be. The very opposite of welcome. And then Matthew pulls these strands together, great pattern and symmetry. But in verse 42 of our passage for today, he says these words, if anyone welcomes you, they welcome me. The word welcome. Doesn't it, even in these early days, fill you with a sense of wistfulness and nostalgia? How, since March 23rd, we would have loved to have welcomed people. Perhaps welcomed people into our homes, people that we longed for, people that we missed, but we couldn't. And then how many times have we longed to welcome people into our church buildings. But because of lockdown, we couldn't offer that welcome. Not in the way that we're used to anyway. Before lockdown, we'd actually done a lot of work on a concept called radical hospitality. That's a concept that's taken from a book by Robert Schnase called The 5 Practices of Fruitful Congregations. Radical hospitality. Since March 23rd, we'd have been happy to be able to offer any kind of hospitality, but sadly we couldn't. I remember, before lockdown, one of the very last sermons I preached, that I mentioned a phrase, which is a very catchy phrase in some ways, and like all catchy phrases, it has some truth in it, but it's not as simple as it sounds. But this was the phrase that I used in a sermon that I preached in late January. And it was this. And he was speaking to the church, and he said, for the church, the age of coming has gone, and the age of going has come. When I used those words, at that time, I couldn't have had any inkling really of just how prophetic those words were going to be. Because for a while, at least, the age of coming has gone. We haven't been able to welcome people into our church buildings, even if they had been coming. And to be fair, by and large, they weren't, were they? But the age of going has come, as the church has been catapulted out of its buildings and onto the internet. This reminds me actually of one sentence I read which parodies a phrase that used to be used at the end of Elvis Presley concerts, where they used to say, Elvis has left the building. There's a phrase going around now on social media saying, the church has left the building. And to be fair, catapulted onto the internet's not a fair phrase either, because to their credit, many churches haven't been catapulted onto the internet. They have embraced the opportunity, and they have started to go now that people can't come, even if they want to. Another pamphlet that's been going around during lockdown period is a pamphlet called Everyone Welcome. And in this pamphlet, the writers liken the church to various cinemas that you might have attended over the years. So they talk about the Church of St. Odeon and the Church of St. Netflix. The Church of St. Odeon is based on the model of the Odeon, quite obviously. If you can remember your days ago to the Odeon, you'll remember some things were true about them. One is that you had to go to that particular building. The other is that they would only be showing one film. And if you didn't like the film that was on that week, then tough. There weren't any others. And they were showing it at a particular time. And if you couldn't make it at that particular time in that particular week, then tough, because that was the only time on offer. It's a real take it or leave it attitude to going to the cinema. And the pamphlet, Everyone Welcomes, likens the church of the past to Odeon, calling it, excuse me, Saint Odeon. Perhaps there would have been one type of service. If you didn't like it, tough, you'd take it or leave it. It's one time of the week. If you didn't like it, tough, take it or leave it. This is Saint Odeon. I've been the minister of Saint Odeon during my journey as a Methodist minister. I can't remember if he mentions this at all in the booklet, but it seems to me that the church could also have been the Church of St. View or the Church of St. Imax. Here the church softened its approach to the take it or leave it style. It realised that just like with multiplex cinemas like the View or IMAX, people want to see different kinds of films and they need different kinds of day to make that possible for them. So the church has modelled that approach too sometimes, being the Church of St. Imax. So, for example, there might have been one service time for those who prefer traditional worship, another service time for those who might prefer what you might describe as more contemporary worship. Again, by and large, those service times have been on a Sunday. Don't get me wrong, I love the Church of St. Odian. I love the Church of St. View. There's so many merits about it. And one of the things that cinemas say is that you can only get the cinema experience by going to the cinema. And that's true for the church as well. There's no substitute for being together and sharing fellowship in person and praising our God together. So don't misunderstand this sermon, will you? I love the Church of St. Odian. I love the Church of St. View, not least the people who make up the congregations. But that's not to say I haven't really been excited and enjoyed being the minister of Saint Netflix. This is what we've had when the church has not relied on people coming, but the church has gone to the people on the internet as we have done. So people aren't stuck to one sermon, take it or leave it. They aren't stuck to one time, take it or leave it. They don't even have to leave their homes. And that's really important actually for being inclusive to people with mobility problems, for example. That's the Church of St. Netflix, is reaching out to the people of the 21st century in a culture and in a way that they can relate to. I don't know if you remember the Odeon that used to be at the top of Aldgate. But the thing about the Odeon, and this is really an example of how old habits die hard, because, you know, ever since I came to Doncaster 27 years ago, I've only ever known it as the Gaumont. Amazing that is, because old habits do die hard. So even though I was a newcomer, I'd never known it as the Gaumont, but if I think about it, I think about the Gaumont. And it's just as though people are saying, well, you know, since the 3rd of September 1934, if the name Gaumont was good enough for my grandparents, then it's good enough for me. But it hasn't actually been called the Gaumont since 1987. The thing is, we may have a wistfulness about the Gaumont or the Odeon, but we can't go back to it even if we want to. Because if you drive past it today, call it what you want, but it's a car park. And it may be that after lockdown, we may not ever be able to go back to the church life that we had before. Never be exactly the way that we knew it. And there are many people starting to think perhaps it's desirable that we shouldn't anyway. Because God has given us this crisis opportunity, not of replacing St. Odian or St. View, that's not what I'm saying, but to realise we can be St. Netflix too. Here's a few things that you might find interesting about the Gaumont. Latterly, the Odeon. Latterly, car park. Here's the first one. It closed down in 2008. And the very last film that it showed was a film called Never Back Down. In our passage today, we find ourselves at the end of a whole section where Jesus has entrusted the mission to the church, including us, of sharing the good news of his kingdom, of showing and sharing his love, of seeking to bring his kingdom into this generation. And here's the thing. we will never back down. But here's the other great snippet about Gaumont News. And if you didn't know this, remember you heard it first here today. When it was sold in 2008, it was sold to a company called Lazarus Properties. We belong to Lazarus Properties. We belong to someone who takes the seemingly and irrecoverably dead, such as Lazarus, and raises them to life. We belong to a man whose business is the Lazarus business. If you wanted to put it in the words of a hymn by Fred Pratt Green, you might phrase it in another way. The Church of Christ, in every age, beset by change but spirit-led, must test and claim its heritage and keep on rising from the dead. We'll claim and test the heritage of St. Odian and St. View. But here's the thing that Jesus is saying to us. I'm raising you to be sent Netflix to you. And I'm saying to the people of God, as I have said to every age and place, Lazarus, come forth.